Hi, my name's Jeff Rudolph. I'm fortunate enough to be here in the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, acting as one of the artists in residence. What got me into sculpture? As a young man, my dad brought home a piece of wood that was unusual and asked me to carve him something in it, and I had no clue. I didn't have the faintest idea, so I took it into my art teacher, and he said, wow, that looks like you could do an Easter Island head in that. And so I ended up carving a great big profile, except it was the 70s, and so I had to do, you know, a beard and a mustache, and it had to be kind of cool. And it turned out really well, and it kind of piqued my interest in carving. That summer, Dad had a job for me. He came home one night and he said, gee, we got all these chairs at the country club that didn't come out right. Mrs. Nielsen ordered all these chairs, and they were oak chairs, and the joints have this beautiful scroll work, and all the scroll work is mismatched. She's so upset, and she wants to send the chairs back, but the company won't take them back. Here's your job for the summer, Jeff. I got you a little chisel and a mallet and a Dremel, and now you can fix all this scroll work in these chairs. Well, no wonder I hated art. I really wanted to be a French horn player. French horn was where my real, true love was. There was only one problem. There was only one hiccup. That was, I couldn't play the French horn to save my life. And then I thought, well, I got to do something else. I know how to carve. I guess I could carve. I had done several carvings by now, just because it was kind of fun. The university brought in a sculptor who'd been carving Italian marble for 30 years. And I don't know, I had this feeling that I just had to take that class. My whole life changed. I dropped out of all my classes except the sculpture class. Virtually quit school, not quite, almost. Had a full-time job at a bronze foundry where I worked for over a year. And then I went back to school and finished my sculpture degree instead of graphic design. Let me tell you about my first teacher in sculpture. He came from Italy, where he'd been sculpting for 30 years. He'd been sculpting stone, specifically, in Italy and Germany. There were 40 of us in a big row, in a big circle rather, and we were all sculpting the same fellow who was on a motorized turntable. We were all doing his portrait. We had water-based clay, and we were all working on the very same thing. And Mr. Anderson was walking around to each student and helping us do our thing. And I was frustrated. I was a little angry. I was upset because my head didn't look right. And I was using my instruments and measuring and trying to get all my measurements just right. But for some reason, nothing was working out. And Mr. Anderson finally got to me, and I said, what is going on? How come I can't get this right? And he said, Jeff, you've elongated this fellow's head. It's okay, it's no big deal. In fact, I want to use it later on in the class. So don't do anything with it. Let's save it. And I'm not happy. I am not a happy guy. And he turned to help the next student next to me, and just before he stepped away, I cut the face off and it fell on his foot. And his face got beet red and the blood vessels popped out, and he walked away. It wasn't long after that he and I developed a totally new relationship. I was the guy who got to empty out all of the big trucks that came with bags of plaster. I was the guy who got to empty out all of the trucks, in fact, that had any supplies for the sculpture studio. We definitely had a love-hate relationship. But as a result, I was hanging around the sculpture studio more than anybody else. And we developed a great friendship. So it was a wonderful experience. After college, I got to work for a couple of different really great artists. I worked for a while for Harry Jackson, and it was fun to work for Harry. Harry is a very inspiring guy, very fiery guy, and it was really great to work for him. I also worked for Bill Davis, for Bill and for Peter Fillerup. Now, my experience in the university was that they taught me how to carve, but they primarily taught me how to carve non-subjective, abstract pieces. And so that's what I carved. And I'll never forget my first show was in Thermopolis, in a bank. And I had 10 or 12 stones, and they were all design-oriented pieces. They weren't realistic like these pieces. They were all abstract, and I had an old rancher guy looking at this one stone, and he just loved it. He just loved it. I could see it in his face. He loved this piece of sculpture. And he would feel it, and he'd walk around it, and he came up to me and he tipped back his hat and he said, "Well, I pretty much like that sculpture. That is a pretty nice piece of rock." And I said, "That's great, great." And he said, "You know, I'd probably buy that, but what the hell good is it?" So I had my spiel. I said, well, these are all curvilinear. They're design-oriented. They're make you feel good type of sculptures. It's all about the design. It's all about the feel of it and putting your hand across it and understanding the composition and the repetition and all of the elements that form a great design. That's what this is really all about. He was not convinced. Well, as good as my spiel was, and I thought it was pretty good, it left second thoughts in my mind. And I went home that night and I thought, you know what? I bet I could carve something realistic. I used to do wood carvings that were realistic. I bet I could do something realistic that had all of the best design components, just like these non-subjective things. And I could meld the two together and I could come up with designs that would be fabulous. And old cowboys like this would say, "Well, that's pretty nice. I like that piece." And you know what? I remember going after a bighorn sheep like this one, and that was one of the best days of my life. That would have made my day. So that was a major influence for me. It changed my art completely. I knew how to carve rabbits, and I started carving rabbits. I must have carved 50 rabbits in stone. And from rabbits, I went to eagles. And from eagles, I went to other animals. And from other animals, I started sculpting people. And I love doing portraits. I used to do portraits in terracotta, water-based clay that was then fired. And I just had the time of my life. I'm still having the time of my life. If someone was to ask me what my favorite mode or medium in sculpture is, I would have to say stone. I like the rhythm and the clink, clink, clink of the hammer on the chisel. I like carving stone. I like turning a corner in the stone and not exactly knowing where that shoulder or that elbow or whatever I'm carving is precisely supposed to be. So I go at it real slow and methodical until I discover it. And then that makes my day. It's fun. It's exciting. Clay is like plastic that you get to mold any way you want in your hands, and then you can do so much with it. Okay, I designed this piece to be carved in stone. You might notice that the legs are really part of the rock. The body of the ram is attached to this rock behind it. That's an important element when you're carving stone, because you don't really want those legs to be completely out away from the rock. That's why this leg, for example, is touching the rock. Your chances of having a successful stone carving experience get a lot better the closer you keep the animal to the stone. Now, I modeled this all in clay because if I immediately just went into stone, I probably wouldn't have been able to do it as well as I would do it working from the clay. I remember a quote I heard in Italy a few years ago. Michelangelo was purported to have said, "Anybody who works in clay is an amateur." The thing that struck me about that was I went to the Bernini Museum in Rome, and Bernini did almost all of his pieces in clay and then translated them into marble. Bernini loved Michelangelo, and I think he stood on Michelangelo's shoulders, and that's what artists need to do. We need to have someone that we admire, we need to have our heroes, and we need to jump into things. I often go to the high school for career days, and I always tell the kids, whatever you do, do the best you can. I'm just a sculptor, but every sculpture I make is $1 million sculpture. I don't do any $1,000 sculptures. They may sell right now for $1,000, but they've always been worth $1 million, and they always will be. If you can have that kind of attitude all the way through your career, whether you're a plumber or a bricklayer or whatever you are, I think your life will be pretty well served. I know that what I want to do is always produce the best sculptures I can. How do I know that it's the best I can? When it's really good, the piece sings. In fact, it almost sounds like a French horn. I think it's tremendous when you do something that is so good, it makes you grow goosebumps. that's when it's good. That's when the trumpet sounds, or rather the French horn. This piece was going great, and I was really happy with it. And then I looked at the back, and the back was just a piece of plywood. And I thought, oh no, that's boring. Well, my intention was to just leave it a rough rock in the back, because after all, I am just carving this in stone. However, the thing that I realized when I saw that flat back was I needed more. I needed more. I needed much more. And so what I did was I decided I needed another animal. And so I started making an armature for a mountain lion, and then I clayed the mountain lion in. Now I think I have a much better sculpture than what I had before. And does it sing yet? Well, it sings a little bit. It's not perfect, but I think it will sing, and the aria will be spectacular. I did this piece hoping to do a stone of it. The body of the sheep is close to the cliff. The body of the mountain lion is also close to the cliff. My intention is to carve this in stone. I love carving stone. So imagine with me, if you will, that this is a bronze sculpture. I'm going to bolt this bronze sculpture after having centered it perfectly on a turntable. That turntable is then linked to another turntable 2 or 3 feet away from it that is much larger. Imagine with me, if you will, that that turntable has a 5,000-pound piece of marble on it. Maybe it's 4 foot tall. Maybe it's 3 or 4 feet in diameter. So these two turntables are centered precisely together, and they're linked together with a belt, and they can't slip. So when you turn this turntable, the other turntable with the stone on it also turns. Imagine with me further that if I had an arm that rested on a ball joint 5 feet away from me, that ball joint hooked to this long arm could go anywhere around this sculpture on either side and up above. On this long arm there is a pointer, and it's adjustable, and I need to center that pointer right on the center of my bronze. I also have a pointer that is centered on the other turntable, and it is centered precisely on the center of the stone. When I go to carve the outlying areas, those are the areas that I start with first because they stick out the furthest. And so I put this pointer as close to maybe this horn tip as I can, and I realize I can't get the pointer to touch that. I can't get it to touch because the pointer that's on the stone is up against the stone. That means I have to carve some of the stone away in order to get this closer to the horn tip. Once I get this close to the horn tip, I don't really want it to touch the horn tip, maybe just get a 1/16 of an inch away. And then I can turn the turntable, which turns the stone, and we'll do another point. Maybe we'll do the nose, and we'll carve away some more stone, then we'll go to another outlying point. Maybe we need to get the outline points on top, so maybe we'll do this point right here, which is the highest point. Then maybe the horn tops, or the top of the rock. And so you go through and you work both sides and all the way around. It's incredibly important that you work all the way around so that you know that you are in sync, that your stone is in sync with your bronze, and that it's going to actually work. Once you do those high points, those outlying areas, then you can start to drill into the deeper areas, and you can work it slowly and methodically. If this is done correctly, a 5,000-pound stone can be easily carved and roughed out, in, I believe, in about 4.5 months. But it takes that much time, it takes that much patience in order not to get too excited to do something stupid and break the stone. Once you've completely roughed out that stone, then it's really great to then take some special tools, maybe some really tight grinding tips, and work the eyes and dig out around the ears a little bit more, and then start polishing the stone. The polishing of marble is a slow and tedious process, but it's incredibly rewarding. And I think one of the ultimate things a sculptor can do professionally, just for himself, is at one point in his career, carve a stone. See if you can do it. Do something big. Do something that Michelangelo would have done. Try something that's a little beyond where you've gone before. What I love about sculpture is the things I don't know. That's what I love about it. The things that I don't understand yet, that I want to understand, and that's really what makes me passionate about my art, are the things I don't know about. And the discovery of those things, wow, that's the best. The sand casting method of casting metal is fairly basic. You take a pattern. With sand casting, you have a pattern maker. And they take that pattern and they have these square boxes that are full of sand, and they take the pattern and they press the pattern into the box. And then they'll take the pattern out very carefully. And then they'll press the other side of the pattern in. Sometimes they press the two boxes together around the pattern. And then they'll take the pattern out, put the two boxes in, and pour the casting. The thing that's interesting, I guess, to me about sand casting is your piece is always going to be solid. It's always going to be a completely solid piece. What I love about the lost wax method of bronze casting is that it is such an art, and the detail that you get in the lost wax method of bronze casting is phenomenal. They have produced plastiline clays that I can put my thumbprint into, and my thumbprint will translate into a mold, and from that mold it will translate into a wax copy of my thumbprint, completely identifiable. And when the foundry makes a mold off of that wax thumbprint, it will translate perfectly into the bronze. That's just a thumbprint. But if I was an important guy, or if I was a crook, the police could easily identify my thumbprint in the bronze. In fact, Harry Jackson used to identify all of his bronzes by a thumbprint that he cast separate from the bronze and plugged into each bronze. When I make a bronze, I start with a model just like this sheep. And I've only got a couple, 3 weeks in this sculpture right now. In a couple more weeks, I'll have it finished. We'll have it detailed, hopefully to where it will sing beautifully. It will raise goosebumps. It will be everything I want it to be. It will be $1 million piece. At that point, I am going to, believe it or not, I'm going to cut it all up into pieces. I'm going to destroy it. I'm going to make a mold off of each of those pieces. I'm going to take that mold, empty out the clay, pour hot wax into each mold. I'm going to be careful that the hot wax is only allowed to be about 1/8 of an inch thick, because I know the best details come from thin waxes. So the wax is only going to be allowed about 1/8 of an inch thick. I'm going to open up all those molds. I'm going to reassemble this sheep and this mountain lion as a wax piece, completely hollow, and I'm going to clean up all the lines where it was cut up, and also all of the seam lines where the mold came together. If there's any air bubbles in it, all of those have to be cleaned up. This has to be as perfect, or maybe more perfect, than the original clay. So at that point, this wax sculpture that's completely hollow goes to the foundry. Now they're going to do some things that they need to do in order to make it easier to cast this piece. One of the things they're going to immediately do is recut the hind quarters off of this piece. They're going to take that piece, set it aside, and they're going to probably take the head of the mountain lion off and set that aside. They're going to gate those pieces, and they're going to do the rest of this piece probably in one piece. They're going to put a gate inside the hollow of this. Your question might be, what's a gate? A gate is a piece of wax that's 1.25 inches square that's extruded. It's extruded wax, so it's as long as we need it to be or as short as we need it to be. That extruded piece of square wax is going to be melted on the end and attached up inside the hollow of this sculpture. On the end of that extruded wax piece, or what I call a gate, what foundries often call a riser, is then put a styrofoam cup. So they take a good sized styrofoam cup, they dip it in wax, coat it with wax, and attach it to the end of the gate. At that point in time, they then do some other wax work. These are called sprues. And sprues are attached to the outlying areas like the horns, maybe the bottom of the nose, areas where they feel they can safely attach another piece of wax, which will then come clear around and be attached close to that cup. At this point, the whole thing goes into a slurry dip of a high-tech ceramic material. It turns the whole thing yellow or green. And after it's dipped, and this, I should say, this material goes inside the wax copy as well as all over the outside. The important thing to remember too is after it's been dipped and the dipping covers everything, then they pour silica sand all over everything too. That's an important part of the process. After that, it is set aside and put up on a shelf, and a fan is put on it to help it dry. Now, earlier I said the foundry's going to cut this hind end off. And the reason they cut that off is for one simple reason. It allows the ceramic slurry to dry much better. If there's an opening or 2 or 3 openings, that really makes a big difference. If that ceramic slurry doesn't get completely dry, you're not going to have a successful casting. It's not going to work. You're going to have all kinds of problems, and you're going to have to start over. The one thing that I hate is having to start over. So, having said that, now we have done this dip and pour sand process for about 6 days. We do it every day, let it dry. Next day, let it dry. After 6 or 8 days, the piece is allowed to dry another day, and then it goes, the whole piece goes into a furnace. And in the furnace, the silica sand and those layers of ceramic slurry fuse together. They get really hard, and then what happens is the wax is melted and burned out of this ceramic mold. And so once the wax is melted out, there are always areas, like maybe a tip of a horn or somewhere, where the wax doesn't melt out, and the wax is burned out of those areas, and so it's completely gone. There's no residue, it's completely gone. At that point, while this ceramic mold is still incredibly hot and right out of the furnace, it is turned upside down, and the bronze is then poured in through that cup that we talked about. In 2 hours or less, the bronze is cold. The cup and part of the gate and all the sprues are cut off. The piece is put into a sandblasting cabinet, and the mold is sandblasted completely clean. And so now we have a bronze, but it doesn't look like a bronze. It's a brass color. It doesn't look anything like a bronze. It's really brassy. Well, bronze is about 95 or 96% copper with tin and zinc and a little bit of silicone to ease or help the viscosity so that when we pour, it pours really nice. And the true color of bronze is more of a brass color. It's not really that dark brown that we think of as bronze. But that's what we think of, and that's what we want to make most generally, is a nice French brown color. And so the next part of the process is to look this all over. By the way, the hind quarters was then gated also, and the mold made on it, and it was poured, and the foundry would then weld that back on. Once that's welded on, they would take a high-speed grinder and grind that weld out and buff that in so it looks beautiful. At that point, where we've got the piece all together and everything looks perfect as it can, now we're ready to do the patina. Quite often the foundry will take a piece when it's close to being ready, they will put it in a sandblast cabinet and sandblast it with glass beads, and the glass beads will shine it up and make it look fabulous. Then they take and put chemicals, and the main chemical that they're it's an acid-based chemical. The main chemical that they're going to use immediately is called liver of sulfur, and that will turn this nice brassy, bright colored bronze black. It's going to turn it completely black, and then the workers in the foundry are going to take Scotch-Brite pads, little abrasive pads, and they're going to buff all of that black off as much as they can. And then they'll treat it with another chemical, most often a chemical that will turn this brown, and that chemical is ferric nitrate. If they wanted a little bit of green somewhere, then they would treat it with cupric nitrate. If they wanted it to be white, they'd go with a titanium nitrate. So there are different chemicals for different things we want to do. One of the things that I love about my work is when I do a stone, it's really smooth, and it has great curvilinear lines, and it has some of those terrific non-subjective abstract design elements that are melded with realistic elements, which make me feel pretty happy. And when I have those elements working out really well, it's cool to see what a great patina artist can do to make that piece look like stone, to make it look like the original, or maybe make it look better than the original, if possible. And that's where we're going. That's what we want. We want better than possible. We want the best. We want $1 million patina. We want $1 million sculpture. I think my art's been influenced by this area primarily because I live in the cowboy capital of the universe. Cody, Wyoming, and cowboys and the Western genre, Buffalo Bill, greatest Western influence anywhere in the universe. You look at a figure like Buffalo Bill, what a tremendous showman, what a real-life hero, what an incredible guy. He was educating the masses as to what it was like to be a pioneer, an explorer, a scout. The austerity of the West is amazing. And so out here, sometimes we joke about, well, Wyoming's nothing but a big sagebrush patch. But the beauty of that sagebrush patch is unsurpassed in many ways. It's unsurpassed. It's part of the beauty of it is the openness of it. The fact that you can go out there and there aren't any fences and there aren't any people, and the only other living thing that you might see out there might be a snake or a pronghorn antelope or a deer. And there's something pretty special about that. And it's that peculiar isolation that makes you think about how you feel, and it makes you think about how great these animals are and how great this landscape really is. It's pretty impressive. And you don't really understand how impressive it is until you get out there and you get lost. And then you know. Then you realize, wow, I am one small guy out here. And when it's dark and you see all those stars, millions, billions, I don't know, they say the universe is expanding all the time, so it's getting bigger. Well, you know your place then, don't you? And if there's something that I can do to live my life in such a way that I can point out some of those beauties. I haven't figured out how to point out the beautiful, how beautiful the universe is. But at least I can point out how beautiful some of the wildlife is. Maybe how beautiful some of the people are, because people are amazing. And maybe, hopefully, point out a little bit about how beautiful the landscape is.